14 minutes. That was how long Corporal Vennick survived after his rebreather's seal cracked during the third push across the sump flats. I was standing 6 meters from him when it happened. The sound was small, almost insignificant against the constant hiss of rain striking the ferrocrete barriers. A wet pop, like a water bladder puncturing. He reached for his throat. His fingers found the split in the rubber seal where the acidic moisture had finally eaten through the secondary gasket layer. I observed his face through his visor for approximately 9 seconds before the first blisters formed along his jawline. He tried to call out. The atmospheric mix entered his lungs. I have archived the sound he made. It was not screaming. Screaming requires sustained breath. This was something else. I was 17 when they conscripted our intake from the lower manufacturing districts of Hive Tertius. The selection officer told us we had been chosen for specialized deployment. He used the word chosen 3 times during the briefing. I noted the repetition. I had worked in the reclamation foundries since I was 11, sorting corroded metal components from the industrial waste streams. My lungs were already compromised from 6 years of particulate exposure. The medical scanner flagged this during processing. The tech adept logged it as acceptable tolerance for atmospheric operations. I did not understand what that meant at the time. I learned. The first thing I remember clearly, before any of this, was the temperature of the loading dock where we assembled for transport. 19 degrees, perhaps 20. Cool enough that I could see my breath in the recycled air, but not cold enough to require thermal wrapping. I stood in formation for 4 hours while they processed our identification tattoos and issued preliminary gear. The man beside me, I never learned his name, kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. The rhythmic scrape of his boots against the deck plating created a pattern. Shift left, count 3. Shift right, count 3. I focused on that sound rather than thinking about what the transport vessel waiting in the docking cradle actually meant. His boots were standard issue. Mine were 2 sizes too large. I had stuffed the toes with ration packaging to keep them from sliding. No one checked. My mother's face. I can still access that file, though the resolution has degraded significantly. She worked the 3rd shift sorting lines in the same reclamation facility where I was assigned after primary education concluded. Her hands were chemically burned from decades of handling processing acids without proper protective equipment. The skin had gone thick and waxy, pale where the worst scarring crossed her knuckles. She touched my face the morning the conscription order came through. Her hands smelled like industrial solvent. That scent is archived more clearly than her features now. Sharp, caustic, the particular bite of chemical compounds designed to break down resistant metals. When I smell promethium exhaust mixed with ozone, sometimes the file loads incorrectly and I register her presence for approximately 2 seconds before the error resolves. The transport took 16 days to reach our assigned deployment sector. They kept us in the lower cargo holds, stacked in suspension racks to conserve space and reduce life support consumption. I was conscious for the first 3 days. The sedation protocols failed to account for the stimulant compounds we had been exposed to in the foundry work. My metabolism processed the initial dose too quickly. I lay in the rack, unable to move more than my eyes, listening to the ship's systems cycle through their operational rhythms. Somewhere in the darkness, another conscript was crying. The sound was steady, mechanical almost. They sedated him again after 6 hours. The crying stopped. I never learned if he woke up. We made orbital insertion on the 19th day of the 3rd month. The deployment briefing lasted 11 minutes. I retained the following information. Planetary designation, Vorinth 7. Atmospheric composition, 73% toxic. Precipitation, highly corrosive. Enemy forces entrenched across the equatorial industrial zones. Expected casualty rate within acceptable parameters for this class of operation. The briefing officer did not define acceptable parameters. I did not ask. We were issued our environmental suits 3 hours before drop. The suit technician who fitted mine spent 14 seconds checking my seals. Standard procedure required 45. He moved down the line. I checked them myself. 3 of the 5 gasket rings on my helmet coupling were already showing microfractures in the rubber substrate. I logged this observation internally. I did not report it. Reporting would have delayed deployment. Delay was recorded as cowardice. Cowardice carried summary execution protocols. The drop was my first experience with sustained fear. Not the abstract concern I had processed when the conscription order arrived, but immediate physical fear that overrode every other system. The insertion pod was designed for 12 personnel. They loaded 16 of us. The man pressed against my left side vomited during the initial descent burn. The vomit pooled inside his helmet. He could not remove it. I heard him choking. The sound lasted for 20, perhaps 25 seconds. Then it stopped. When the pod doors blew open and we spilled onto the surface of Vorinth 7, he remained in his harness. His face was blue behind the visor. The vomit had blocked his respirator intake. No one removed his body. We were ordered to advance immediately. The air outside the pod moved wrong. That was my first observation upon exposure. Not the color, which was a yellow-gray that reminded me of the chemical runoff in the foundry's lower processing tanks. Not the smell, which penetrated even the suit's filtration with an acidic edge that made my sinuses burn. The movement. Air on a standard atmospheric world flows in predictable patterns affected by temperature differentials and pressure systems. The air on Vorinth moved in layers, thick streams of it that drifted parallel to the ground like slow water. When the wind picked up, these layers sheared against each other, creating visible turbulence that looked like heat distortion but was actually particulate suspension of corrosive compounds dense enough to see. It was raining. It never stopped raining. The drops were smaller than normal precipitation, more like a constant mist that fell with unusual weight. Where they struck my suit's shoulder plating, they left dark spots that slowly spread. I watched one droplet land on the back of my glove. The clear, rubberized coating began to cloud within 5 seconds. After 20 seconds, the discoloration had penetrated the outer layer. I wiped it against my leg plating. The smear it left looked like acid burn patterns in metal. I noted this. I continued moving. The ground was wrong, too. We had landed in what the tactical briefing had designated an industrial zone. The structures around us were processing facilities of some kind, their purposes long since abandoned, but their massive ferrocrete shells still standing. The ground between them was not earth or rock-crete pavement, but a kind of thick sludge that had settled into a semi-solid state over time. It held weight, but shifted unpredictably. Each step sank approximately 4 centimeters before finding resistance. The effort required to pull my boots free increased rapidly. After 10 minutes of movement, my legs were burning. After 30 minutes, 2 men in my squad had collapsed from exhaustion. The sergeant ordered them to continue. They did not. He shot one of them. The other managed to stand. We kept moving. My weapon was an M36 las rifle, standard pattern, fitted with an environmental protection shroud over the barrel assembly and power pack. The shroud was supposed to prevent atmospheric corrosion from degrading the focusing rings and charge coils. During the first engagement, 3 hours after insertion, my weapon fired 72 shots before the beam coherence began to degrade visibly. By shooting 115, the last bolts were diffusing so badly they were ineffective beyond 30 meters. I reported this to Sergeant Hale. He told me to continue firing. I did. The weapon ceased function entirely at shot 209. I spent the next 6 hours attempting to clean the barrel assembly while we held position in the ruins of a processing complex. The corrosion had penetrated the shroud through microscopic gaps in the seal points. The focusing rings were pitted. I could scrape the corrosion away with my field tool, but it reformed within minutes. I cleaned the weapon 4 times during that rest period. Each time, the corrosion returned faster. I learned during the first week that the enemy we were fighting was not the greatest threat to operational survival. The enemy, entrenched forces from what remained of the local industrial militia, were engaged primarily with basic projectile weapons and improvised explosives. They killed approximately 3 men from my company during that first week. The environment killed 27. The numbers are precise because I was assigned to casualty documentation duties after the 3rd day, when the assigned clerk died from respiratory exposure after his suit's atmospheric processor failed. Corporal Dennick died on day 4. His suit's left boot developed a split along the sole seam. The acidic sludge we walked through entered the boot. He continued walking for approximately 40 minutes before requesting permission to halt and address the issue. Permission was denied. We were advancing under contact protocols. He walked for another 20 minutes before his leg gave out. When we finally stopped and I assisted him in removing the boot, the flesh of his foot had dissolved down to the metatarsal bones in 3 places. The bones were visible. They were also corroding. The acidic compound had seeped into the bone tissue and was breaking it down at a visible rate. I watched the surface of his exposed bones darken and pit while I attempted to neutralize the acid with the alkaline compounds from the medical supply. It did not work quickly enough. He died that night from systemic toxicity after the absorbed compounds reached critical concentration in his bloodstream. I logged his identification number and added him to the casualty list. I kept his ration allotment. No one questioned this. The suits we wore were supposed to protect us for 96 hours of continuous exposure before requiring maintenance cycling and seal replacement. This was the operational parameter provided during the equipment issue. The suits began failing after 40 hours on average. I documented this. The primary failure points were the gasket seals at joint connections and any point where the suit material experienced repetitive stress. The knees failed frequently, the elbow joints, the glove connections. The next seal. Every failure was fatal or mission compromising. There was no minor exposure on Vorinth 7. The atmospheric mix did not cause discomfort followed by gradual illness. It caused immediate chemical burns on contact with organic tissue, followed by systemic absorption, followed by organ failure. The timeline from exposure to death ranged from 4 minutes to 6 hours depending on the exposure site and volume of atmospheric contact. We received replacement seals on day 9. The supply drop included 14 seal kits for a company of 147 men. I was assigned to distribution and installation duties. I made decisions during this process. The men who showed the greatest seal degradation received the kits first. This was logical resource allocation. It was also a choice that condemned the men with moderate seal degradation to eventual failure. Corporal Tamnik questioned this distribution pattern. His suit seals were showing early-stage cracking but had not yet failed. He argued he should receive a kit before his seals reached critical failure rather than waiting until emergency replacement was required. His logic was sound. I denied his request. There were not enough kits. 4 days later, his knee seal failed during a night advance. The acid exposure destroyed the tissue of his lower leg before we could halt and attempt treatment. He survived the immediate injury. Infection set in within 30 hours. We had no antibiotics suitable for chemical burn complications. He died on day 17. I archived his death as equipment failure. I did not log my distribution decision as a contributing factor. This was not an oversight. This was a choice. I met Rishen on day 23. He was transferred into our company as a replacement after his original unit suffered catastrophic casualties during an advance through what the tactical maps designated the Eastern Corrosion Fields. He told me later there were regions where the atmospheric acidity was so concentrated that it formed visible vapor clouds that would strip an environmental suit's outer coating in under a minute. His company had been ordered to advance through one of these zones. 40 men entered. 6 emerged. He was one of them. When he joined our formation, he was checking his suit seals every 4 minutes. I timed it across multiple observations to confirm the pattern. Every 4 minutes, his gloved hands would run the check sequence. Helmet coupling, neck seal, shoulder joints, elbow connections, glove seals, torso zip line, hip joints, knee connections, boot seals, then back to helmet coupling. The entire sequence took approximately 35 seconds. Then he would wait. Then he would do it again. I asked him why. He looked at me through his visor. The lighting in the shelter we were occupying was poor, a single glow rod that cast everything in green-gray shadow. His eyes were very pale, almost colorless in that light. He said, "Because the moment I stop checking is the moment something fails." His voice through the suit's internal Vox system was flat, calm. He was not joking. I understood this was his operational protocol for survival. I found it sound. I began checking my own seals every 6 minutes. The increased frequency identified 2 developing failures over the next week that I was able to address before they reached critical state. Rishen's methodology was effective. I integrated it. He talked while we performed maintenance procedures. This was unusual. Most men did not talk more than necessary. Speaking requires energy. Energy was rationed as carefully as ammunition and water. But Rishen talked. He described his original deployment, the composition of the corrosion fields, the way the vapor moved, heavier than air, rolling across the ground in slow waves that would overtake a running man. He described watching a squad leader dissolve. That was the word he used. Dissolve. The man had fallen during the retreat from the vapor cloud. His suit had been compromised by a projectile impact that had torn through his back plating. He was still alive when the vapor reached him. Richin had been 15 meters away. He watched the suit material break down first, the rubberized coating sliding off the underlying fabric in sheets. Then the fabric itself separated into constituent fibers. Then the man's exposed skin began to separate. Richin described it as similar to watching ice melt, but faster and with more screaming. The man lived for approximately 2 minutes after the vapor made contact. Richin had archived the exact duration, 2 minutes and 17 seconds. He replayed this file often, I think. The precision of his recall suggested frequent access. I asked him why he continued checking his seals if he had survived an exposure that killed most of his unit. His survival suggested either superior equipment or superior technique. Either factor would reduce his statistical risk on future deployments. His seal-checking compulsion seemed disproportionate to his demonstrated survival capability. He did not answer for 18 seconds. Then he said, "I survived because Corporal Den shoved me forward when the vapor came. He was behind me. He took the concentration that would have reached me first. His suit failed. Mine did not. I did not survive because I was better. I survived because he died instead." He paused. "I check the seals because I do not trust that luck will function twice." I noted this. I did not argue with his logic. Survival analysis supports both equipment, maintenance, and statistical probability as factors. His concern was valid. We continued our maintenance work. He showed me a technique for reinforcing knee seal connections using adhesive compound and spare gasket material scavenged from damaged suits. The technique extended seal operational life by approximately 30% in my testing. I showed him how to clean laser rifle, focusing assemblies using a specific scraping pattern that minimized tool-induced scoring while maximizing corrosion removal. We exchanged survival techniques like this for 6 weeks. Each technique traded increased immediate survival probability against some other resource: time, material, energy, expenditure. We calculated these trades constantly. This was how survival was measured on Vorinth 7, not in victories or successful missions, but in hours of continued function before the environment or the enemy or the equipment failures rendered you inoperative. The rain was constant. I've tried to articulate this properly multiple times in this record, and the language continues to fail the actual experience. It was not raining heavily. It was not a downpour or a storm. It was a continuous, fine, acidic mist that fell every hour of every day without variation. It was so constant that its absence would have been more notable than its presence. After the first month, I stopped consciously registering it. It was simply the default state of existence. Wet. Corroding. There. The sound it made when it struck the suit material was a soft hiss, thousands of tiny impacts creating a white noise that drowned out quieter sounds. We learned to speak louder to compensate. We learned to identify threats by visual confirmation rather than auditory warning. We learned that the hiss was normal and that silence meant either your audio pickup had failed or you had moved into a structure with sufficient overhead cover to block the rain. Silence became dangerous. Silence meant something had changed. Change was almost always negative. By the end of the second month, my original company of 147 men had been reduced to 63 operational personnel, 84 casualties, 41 from equipment failure leading to environmental exposure, 27 from enemy action, 16 from what the casualty reports termed operational complications, which included exhaustion death, infection from minor wounds that became major due to environmental contamination, falls into corrosive sludge pools, and one incident where a man removed his helmet deliberately during a rest period. I witnessed that. I do not believe it was accidental. He had been checking his seals constantly for 3 days, every 2 minutes toward the end. He had been talking to himself through the Vox system, a running commentary that became increasingly fragmented. The sergeant told him to maintain Vox discipline. He complied for perhaps 20 minutes. Then he resumed. Then he stopped. Then he reached up, disengaged his helmet coupling, and lifted the helmet off his head. The atmospheric mix entered his lungs. He dropped the helmet. He fell to his knees. He died in approximately 4 minutes. No one moved to stop him. By the time anyone processed what he was doing, intervening would have required exposure to save a man who had already chosen exposure. The logic did not support intervention. We left him where he fell and continued the advance 30 minutes later. His body was still twitching when we moved out. The atmospheric acid was still working. Richin and I were assigned to forward scout duty during the 3rd month. This was either recognition of our survival capabilities or acknowledgement that we were expendable resources, best utilized in high-risk roles. I did not ask which. Scout duty required moving ahead of the main company advance to identify enemy positions and environmental hazards. We operated in a 2-man team with limited Vox contact and no support assets. The assignment lasted 19 days. During that period, we existed in a state of continuous isolation, punctured by brief contact with the company, when we returned to deliver reconnaissance reports. The isolation was not peaceful. It was not restful. It was a sustained operational state where every decision carried immediate survival consequences, and no external authority existed to validate or correct our choices. On day 7 of the scout assignment, we identified what we believed to be an enemy supply cache in the lower levels of a collapsed refinery complex. The structure's roof had failed at some point, allowing decades of acidic rain to pour into the interior spaces. The result was a corroded maze of buckled floors, dissolved support columns, and pools of concentrated acidic sludge that had settled in the lower points of the facility. We spent 6 hours mapping a route through this space to reach the suspected cache location. The route required crossing 3 separate sludge pools using debris as stepping points. The pools were not deep, perhaps half a meter at most, but depth was irrelevant. Contact was fatal. Richin crossed first. He moved carefully, testing each piece of debris before committing his weight, always maintaining 3 points of contact. He reached the far side. I followed. On the second pool crossing, the debris I was using as a stepping stone shifted. It was a section of support beam, approximately 2 meters long, resting on submerged rubble. When I placed my weight on it, the submerged end slipped. The beam tilted. I fell forward. My hands contacted the pool surface. I felt the resistance of the sludge, thicker than water, clinging. I pushed myself up. I regained my footing. I crossed to the far side. My gloves were covered in the acidic compound. I could see it eating into the rubberized coating, the material darkening and beginning to separate. Rishin was already moving. He had his field kit open. He pulled out the neutralization compound, a thick alkaline paste, and began spreading it across my gloves without speaking. The paste reacted with the acid, producing heat and a chemical smell that penetrated my suit filters. We used the entire tube on both gloves. When we cleaned away the paste and the neutralized compound, the glove surfaces were scarred and pitted but intact. The coating had held, barely. Another 3 seconds of contact, and the acid would have eaten through to the fabric layer. From there, perhaps another 5 seconds to reach skin. Rishin checked my glove seals 3 times before he was satisfied they had not been compromised. Then he checked his own seals. Then we continued into the facility. The cache did not exist. What we found was a dead enemy combatant, perhaps 3 months deceased, his body partially dissolved into the floor where he had fallen. His equipment was corroded beyond recovery. We had spent 6 hours and most of our remaining neutralization compound to reach a corpse. Rishin looked at the body for a long time. Then he turned and began the return crossing. We did not speak about it. There was nothing to say. Intelligence was imperfect. Operations were conducted on imperfect intelligence. Risks were accepted. Sometimes the outcome was negative. This was simply operational reality. But something had changed during that crossing, or perhaps it had been changing gradually, and I only registered it consciously after that incident. Rishin had not hesitated when I fell. He had reacted immediately, prioritizing my survival over any other consideration, including his own resource conservation. He had used the neutralization compound, which was irreplaceable until we returned to the company and drew new supplies, without calculating whether the expenditure was justified by my operational value. He simply acted. And I had allowed him to. I had not argued against the compound usage. I had not suggested he conserve it for a more critical need. I had accepted his assistance because at that moment I wanted to survive, and he was offering me the means to do so. This was not logical resource allocation. This was something else. I did not have vocabulary for it then. I am not certain I have vocabulary for it now that fully captures the operational reality. He had chosen to prioritize my survival. I had chosen to accept that prioritization. These were choices that existed outside the standard decision matrix of resource management and survival probability. They were choices that suggested a framework I had not been trained to process. Connection, perhaps. Investment in another individual's continuation beyond their utility value. The files I've archived from before conscription contain references to this type of connection. Family structures, friendship bonds. I had observed these among some of the company personnel, usually men who had been conscripted from the same intake groups and maintained those original associations. I had not developed similar connections. I had processed other personnel as resources, some more reliable than others, all ultimately expendable when operational parameters required it. But when Rishin used the neutralization compound on my gloves, I had not processed his action as resource misallocation. I had processed it as something I did not want to lose. Him. His continued function. his presence in my operational environment. This was inefficient. This was a vulnerability. This was, I think, the first time since conscription that I had chosen to value something beyond my own survival. I noted this development. I did not suppress it. I am still uncertain whether that was a failure of discipline or whether I had already progressed beyond the point where suppression was possible. We returned from the scout assignment on day 19. The company had been reduced to 51 personnel during our absence. They had attempted to advance through a sector designated on tactical maps as a low contamination zone. The designation was incorrect. Atmospheric testing had been performed months prior. The contamination levels had increased significantly on the interval. 12 men died from rapid exposure when their suits failed simultaneously during the advance. The entire sector's atmosphere had been saturated with corrosive vapor at ground level, invisible in the constant rain until men started falling. The company had retreated. They had lost the ground they had been ordered to take. High Command logged it as acceptable losses during reconnaissance operations. The dead were not replaced. The company continued operations at reduced strength. Richin and I were reassigned to equipment maintenance duties. This was supposed to be a low-intensity assignment, a brief operational pause before the next advance cycle. It was not. Maintenance on Vorinth 7 was not the systematic care of equipment under controlled conditions. It was a continuous emergency response to cascading failures across every system we carried. The environmental suits required seal replacement every 72 hours minimum. We did not have enough seal kits. We improvised, we scavenged, we took seals from damaged suits whose wearers no longer required them. We took seals from corpses before burial details could process them. We developed a priority system. Operational personnel first, wounded second, support personnel last. This meant some men went into combat operations with seals we knew were compromised. This meant we sent them to die, because we did not have the materials to properly protect them. This was logical resource allocation. This was also murder by calculated neglect. I understood both of these things simultaneously. I continued making the allocation decisions. Rishin did not argue with my priorities. He implemented them, but I observed him checking seal allocations after I assigned them, running his hands over the gasket material, testing the flexibility, and checking for micro-fractures I might have missed. 3 times he brought me seals I had designated as operational and showed me flaws I had not detected. Each time I reassigned those seals to lower priority personnel and drew from the dwindling reserve stock for the original recipient. Each time, the man who received the flawed seal died within a week. Rishin was saving lives by making my death allocation decisions more accurate. We did not discuss this. We simply continued the work. On day 94 of deployment, High Command issued operational orders for a major offensive across the central industrial sector. Intelligence reported enemy force concentration had decreased. Atmospheric conditions were forecasted to improve. The orders specified a 3-company advance with armor support and aerial reconnaissance. Our company, now designated Task Unit Epsilon, would form the left flank of the advance. Expected casualties were listed as acceptable. The offensive was scheduled for day 98. We received equipment resupply on day 96. 23 complete environmental suits, 40 seal replacement kits, 72 las rifle power cells, 30 kilograms of neutralization compound, and 16 rebreather filter assemblies. For 51 personnel preparing for a major offensive into a high contamination zone, this was insufficient. I calculated that if we redistributed the new suits to the most critical personnel and scavenged components from our existing suits to repair the remainder, we could field 42 personnel with functional equipment at the start of the offensive. 9 men would enter combat with equipment I could not certify as operational. I presented this analysis to Lieutenant Craig. He acknowledged it. He ordered me to issue all available equipment and ensure every man was suited for the advance. I complied. Rishen received one of the new suits. I made that decision consciously. His existing suit had been compromised in 4 separate locations, all of them repaired with improvised sealing compounds that I knew would fail under sustained exposure. He should have been rotated off combat operations until proper repairs could be completed. There was no rotation, there was only the advance. I gave him a new suit. I took his old one and broke it down for component scavenging. He did not thank me. He did not need to. We both understood what the allocation meant. I had chosen his survival over someone else's. Corporal Mennick went into the offensive with a suit I knew had a compromised knee seal. He died on day 99 when that seal failed during a fighting withdrawal across a sludge field. The acid destroyed his leg before anyone could reach him. He bled out in the sludge while we retreated past his position. I had allocated him that suit. I knew it would fail. I had chosen to give the functional suit to Rishen instead. This was the complicity moment, I think, though I have revisited the timeline many times and I am no longer certain there was a single moment. Perhaps it was the accumulation of decisions across 3 months of operations. Perhaps it was the first time I allocated resources knowing some men would die as a result. Perhaps it was earlier, during initial training, when I learned that survival required accepting others would not survive. But this felt significant in a way the previous decisions had not. I had chosen Rishen's life over Mennick's life consciously, deliberately, for reasons that were not operationally justified. Rishen was not a better soldier than Mennick. He was not more critical to the mission. He was simply someone whose continued existence I had decided to prioritize, and Mennick had died because of that choice. I logged Mennick's death as equipment failure during combat operations. I did not note the SEAL's compromised status. I did not note my allocation decision. The report was filed. No one questioned it. No one audited equipment allocation logs to determine if proper procedures had been followed. There were too many deaths for that level of scrutiny. The system assumed competence and accepted losses as operational inevitability. The system allowed me to make choices that killed men and never required me to answer for those choices, beyond filing the appropriate documentation. I had become part of that system. I had become a mechanism by which the system consumed personnel while maintaining the bureaucratic fiction of proper procedure and acceptable losses. The offensive lasted 6 days. We advanced 4 kilometers. We took the designated objectives on day 3. We lost them on day 5 when enemy counterattacks forced a general withdrawal. We returned to our original positions on day 6. The operation was logged as a successful reconnaissance in force. Task Unit Epsilon suffered 31 casualties during the offensive. 20 men remained operational at its conclusion. Rishen and I survived. We survived because we had functional equipment. We had functional equipment because I had allocated it to us. Other men had died with compromised equipment. The chain of causation was clear. We did not discuss this. We performed our duties. We maintained what equipment remained. We prepared for the next operation, but something had shifted in how we existed in proximity to each other. When Rishen checked his seals, I found myself watching to ensure he completed the sequence properly. When I cleaned my weapon, he would position himself to observe my work. We were monitoring each other's survival protocols without coordination or discussion. This was inefficient. This was redundant. This was also the only thing that made continued function seem purposeful rather than simply mechanical. On day 107, Lieutenant Craig died from pulmonary exposure after his rebreather filter assembly failed during a routine patrol. Sergeant Hale assumed command. He promoted me to corporal and assigned me as Task Unit Epsilon's acting logistics coordinator. This was recognition of my equipment management capabilities. This was also an assignment of responsibility for every future allocation decision that resulted in someone's death. I accepted the position. I had no grounds to refuse. I had already been performing the function. The promotion simply formalized what had been operational reality for months. Richen received no promotion. He was assigned as my logistics assistant. This meant we worked together constantly, cataloging equipment, performing repairs, making allocation decisions. The decisions became easier through repetition. I developed frameworks and criteria. Functional equipment went to personnel with the highest probability of extended survival based on historical performance and observed competence. Compromised equipment went to personnel with diminished survival probability. We did not call them death allocations. We called them priority assignments. The language made the function possible. Rishen never questioned my priorities. He also never allowed me to falsify documentation. When I attempted to log a seal as functional that I knew was compromised, he would stop me. He would point to the flaw. He would insist I log it accurately. I learned to maintain accurate records because he would not permit me to do otherwise. This was both frustrating and necessary. The accurate records created a documented history of exactly how we were killing men through equipment allocation. If anyone ever audited those logs with hostile intent, I could be executed for negligence or dereliction resulting in preventable deaths. But the accurate records also prevented me from losing track of reality. They forced me to acknowledge what each allocation meant. Rishen understood this, I think. He was keeping me honest in the only way that mattered, by not allowing me to lie to myself about what we were doing. I need to describe what happened to him properly. I have tried multiple times to structure this segment of the record, and the organization continues to fail. The chronology is clear, the data is precise, but the experience of it, the way time moved during those hours, does not translate into sequential testimony. I will attempt it anyway. Day 133. We received orders for another offensive, this one targeting enemy positions in the northern industrial sectors. Task Unit Epsilon, now reduced to 17 personnel, would operate as a reconnaissance element ahead of the main assault force. We had been provided with replacement personnel 2 days prior, bringing our strength to 26, but the new personnel were raw conscripts, undertrained and poorly equipped. They were assigned the compromised suits. This was logical. They had the lowest survival probability. Issuing them functional equipment would waste resources when they died from inexperience. Rishin and I were assigned to forward reconnaissance ahead of the main unit. We had performed this duty before. We understood the parameters. We drew 5 days of supplies and moved out at dawn on day 134. The rain was heavier than usual that morning. Not a storm. There were no storms on Vorinth 7, just variations in the constant precipitation. Heavier meant the drops were slightly larger, slightly more frequent. The hiss of rain on suit material increased in volume. Visibility decreased from approximately 40 meters to approximately 25. We adjusted our movement protocols for the reduced visibility and proceeded. The first 3 days were routine. We identified 2 enemy observation posts and 1 supply route. We documented these and transmitted the data. We avoided contact. We moved carefully through the corroded industrial ruins, testing every surface before committing weight, checking seals every 6 minutes, conserving our neutralization compound and filter supplies. On the 3rd day, we discovered what the tactical maps had designated as a processable route through the sector was actually a region where the ground-level corrosion had become so severe that the ferrocrete foundations had dissolved entirely in places, leaving gaps that dropped into the lower infrastructure levels where the acidic runoff had pooled in concentrated reservoirs. We were mapping an alternate route when Rishen's right knee seal failed. There was no warning. The gasket material had been gradually degrading from flexion stress, microfractures propagating through the substrate until the material reached critical failure density. When he knelt to examine a potential crossing point, the seal split. I heard it over the vox. A small sound. Then his breathing changed. Sharp intake. Hold your breath. I turned. He was still kneeling. His hand was on his right knee, pressing against the seal point. I could see the darkening on his suit material where the atmospheric moisture was making contact. I moved to him. I had the field kit open before I reached him. He was trying to stand. His leg was not responding correctly. The acid was already inside the suit, in contact with his skin. I pulled out the neutralization compound. The tube was half empty. We had used most of it during the advance to treat minor contamination events. I spread the entire remaining contents across his knee, working it into the failed seal, trying to neutralize the acid that had already penetrated while simultaneously trying to create a temporary barrier against further atmospheric contact. The compound foamed as it reacted. The heat of the reaction was visible as steam in the cold acidic air. Richin was not screaming. His breathing was harsh over the vox, rapid shallow pulls of air. But he was not screaming. He was trying to maintain seal contact with his hand while I worked. I could see his fingers pressing into the compromised area, the suit material deforming under the pressure. I told him to keep pressure on the seal. I pulled sealing tape from the kit. The tape was designed for temporary field repairs. It would hold for perhaps 30 minutes under ideal conditions. These were not ideal conditions. I wrapped his knee in 3 layers of tape, trying to cover the failed seal completely. The tape adhered poorly to the neutralization compound residue. I used the entire roll. When I finished, his knee was wrapped in dirty gray tape that was already beginning to darken from atmospheric contact. The seal was not functional. The tape was not a repair. It was a delay. I had perhaps 20, maybe 30 minutes before the acid ate through the tape layers and resumed destroying his leg. I looked at him. His face through the visor was very pale. Sweat was running down his temples despite the cold. He said, "How long?" I told him the truth. 20 to 30 minutes before the tape failed. After that, progressive tissue damage, systemic absorption, probable loss of consciousness within 2 hours, death within 6 hours, unless we could get him to a medical facility with proper decontamination capability. The nearest facility was 9 kilometers south. The company position was 6 kilometers southeast. I could not carry him for 9 kilometers. I could potentially support him for 6 kilometers if he could maintain partial weight bearing on the damaged leg. He processed this. Then he said, "The mission." The mission. We had not completed the reconnaissance assignment. We had not mapped the complete alternate route. The offensive was scheduled to begin in 36 hours. The tactical data we had been sent to collect was incomplete. Returning now meant the data would remain incomplete. The offensive would proceed with imperfect intelligence. Men would die because they advanced into terrain we should have mapped. This was operationally unacceptable. It was also irrelevant. Richin was going to die if we did not move immediately. The mission was already compromised. Completing it would not change that. I told him we were returning to the company position immediately. He started to argue. I did not allow it. I pulled him up. He got his good leg under him. I took his weight on my right side. We began moving south. We covered perhaps 400 meters in the first hour. Each step required coordination. He would swing the damaged leg forward, keeping it as straight as possible to minimize knee flexion and stress on the tape seal. I would support his weight while he transferred to the good leg. Then we would advance together until he could plant the good leg again. The process was exhausting. The effort of supporting his weight while maintaining my own balance in the treacherous terrain consumed my energy reserves rapidly. After the first hour, I was shaking from muscle fatigue. After the second hour, I was moving mechanically, no longer thinking about each step, simply executing the movement pattern repetitively. Rishin's breathing had changed. It was slower now, deeper. He was regulating it consciously, trying to manage pain through controlled respiration. He did not speak except to warn me about terrain obstacles. His hand gripped my shoulder. I could feel the pressure through the suit material. The pressure was constant. He was holding on. The tape failed after 2 hours and 40 minutes. I saw the darkening spread suddenly across his knee, the gray tape turning black as the acid-saturated atmospheric moisture penetrated the final layer. Rishin made a sound. Not a scream. Something deeper. A grunt of pain that became a sustained exhalation. His grip on my shoulder tightened. His legs started to give out. I held him. I kept us moving. There was nothing else to do. We were still 4 kilometers from the company position. Stopping meant dying. Moving meant probably dying, but moving meant dying while still advancing toward the only possibility of survival. He spoke after another 30 minutes. His voice was very quiet. He said, "I can't feel my foot anymore." I did not respond. There was nothing useful to say. The loss of sensation indicated nerve damage from tissue destruction or systemic toxicity affecting nerve function. Both possibilities had the same implication. The damage was severe and progressing. I adjusted my support, taking more of his weight. He was leaning heavily on me now, barely able to maintain balance even with support. We kept moving. I do not remember most of the next 2 hours in sequential detail. I remember specific moments. The weight of him against my side, the sound of his breathing over the vox, each breath requiring visible effort. The way his hand would spasm occasionally on my shoulder, grip loosening and then suddenly tightening as he fought to maintain consciousness. The rain, the constant rain, the hiss of it on our suits, the way it ran down our visors. I remember counting steps for a while. I lost count somewhere after 2,000. I remember falling once. We both went down. I got him up again. His damaged leg was not responding at all by then. He could not put any weight on it. I was carrying him more than supporting him. He was trying to help, trying to move his good leg, trying to transfer weight, but his coordination was failing. The toxicity was affecting his motor control. He asked me to stop. We were perhaps 2 kilometers from the company position, maybe less. I could not determine our exact location. Navigation in the industrial ruins was difficult under ideal circumstances. Exhausted and supporting a dying man, I was navigating by approximate heading and dead reckoning. He asked me to stop. I did not stop. He asked again. His voice was very faint. He said, "Vex, stop, please." I stopped. I lowered him to the ground as carefully as I could manage. He sat with his back against a section of collapsed wall. His damaged leg was extended. I could see the suit material around his knee was dissolving. The acid had eaten through completely now. Atmospheric moisture was in direct contact with the destroyed tissue beneath. I could not see the wound through the suit material, but I could see the way the material was disintegrating, edges curling back, exposing the interior. He was watching me. His eyes were unfocused. Pupils dilated. He was going into shock. I pulled out the medical kit. We had 1 stimulant injector. I administered it. The stimulant would buy perhaps 30 more minutes of consciousness. Perhaps. He did not need 30 minutes of consciousness. He needed a medical facility and proper decontamination. I had neither. I had a single stimulant and approximately 40 minutes of carrying capacity left before my own exhaustion made further movement impossible. I looked at him. He looked back. He said, "You can't carry me 2 kilometers." He was correct. I could not. I had been able to support him when he could still assist with movement. Now he was dead weight. I could drag him perhaps, but dragging him across the corrosive sludge and broken terrain would likely cause additional suit failures. It would also exhaust me completely within perhaps half a kilometer. Then we would both die here. The alternative was leaving him and returning with support. I could cover 2 kilometers alone in perhaps 45 minutes if I did not stop. I could return with help. We could recover him. If he survived the interim, if the company had the resources to mount a recovery operation, if the toxicity did not kill him before we returned. I was calculating these probabilities out loud. I did not realize I was speaking until he interrupted me. He said, "Vex, stop calculating." His hand found my arm. He could barely grip. His fingers were trembling. He said, "You need to go. You need to return to the company. The mission data needs to be delivered." The mission data. I had almost forgotten the mission data. I had been thinking only about his survival. The mission had become irrelevant somewhere during the past 3 hours. But he was correct. The data was the only justification for this entire operation. If I failed to deliver it, everything that had happened, his injury, the compromised mission, All of it became simply waste with no operational value recovered. I needed to return. I needed to report. That was the function I was assigned to perform. I told him I would return with support. I told him to maintain consciousness. I told him to keep checking his seals. He nodded. He was not checking his seals. His hands were not moving properly anymore. I adjusted him into a more stable position against the wall. I checked that his rebreather was still functioning. The filter indicator showed 40% capacity remaining. Enough for 3, maybe 4 hours. I told him I would return within 2 hours. He nodded again. He said, "I know you will try." I stood. I needed to move immediately or I would not move at all. I took 2 steps away from him. I stopped. I turned back. I did not have words for what I needed to say. I had not developed vocabulary for this. I said, "Revan." He looked at me. I said, "Thank you for the neutralization compound. On day 31 in the refinery, you didn't have to use it." He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "Yes, I did." 2 more seconds. "You would have done the same." I wanted to tell him that was not true. I wanted to tell him I was not capable of that type of choice, that I calculated resources and made allocation decisions and prioritized survival probability, and that using irreplaceable supplies to save someone was not within my operational framework. But I could not say that, because it would be false. I had given him the functional suit. I had made allocation decisions that prioritized his survival. I had been making those decisions for months. He knew this. I said, "Yes, I would have." He smiled. It looked painful. He said, "Then go do it now. Go get the support. I'll wait here." I went. I covered the 2 kilometers in 37 minutes. I do not remember most of the movement. I remember arriving at the company perimeter. I remember Sergeant Hale's face when I gave the situation report. I remember him telling me there were no available personnel for immediate recovery operations. The company was at minimum defensive strength. An enemy probe had engaged the perimeter 4 hours prior. 2 men were dead. 3 were wounded. He could not spare a recovery team. I told him Richin had perhaps 2 hours of viability remaining. He told me recovery operations would be possible in 6 hours when the next shift rotation completed. 6 hours. Richin would be dead in 6 hours. I knew this. Sergeant Hale knew this. He was making the same calculation I had made dozens of times. The resources required to attempt recovery did not justify the low probability of successful outcome. I requested permission to return alone with medical supplies. Denied. I was required to debrief intelligence staff on the reconnaissance findings. I was the only source for the tactical data. The offensive was launched in 31 hours. The data took priority over individual casualty recovery. This was logical. This was correct resource allocation. This was watching someone I had chosen to value die because the system required my function elsewhere. The debriefing lasted 43 minutes. I provided map coordinates, enemy position data, terrain analysis, and route recommendations. The intelligence officer logged everything. He asked clarifying questions. I answered them. My voice was steady. My hands were steady. I was performing my function correctly. Inside, I was counting minutes. 43 minutes of debriefing meant Rishin had perhaps 77 minutes remaining if my initial timeline estimate was accurate. Probably less. Toxicity progression was variable. He might already be unconscious. He might already be dead. When the debriefing concluded, I went to Sergeant Hale again. I requested permission to organize a recovery operation. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Corporal, I cannot authorize personnel for a recovery operation. However, if you choose to conduct personal equipment inventory and testing in the northern sector, that is within your operational discretion as logistics coordinator." He paused. "I would recommend you take someone with experience in field medical procedures if such inventory requires two-man team protocols." He was giving me permission without giving me permission. If I succeeded, it was initiative. If I failed, it was an unauthorized absence during operational standby. I acknowledged and left immediately. I found Private Kellis, the company's remaining medical assistant. I told him we were conducting equipment inventory in the northern sector. He looked at my face. He did not ask questions. He gathered medical supplies and followed me. We moved fast, faster than was safe in that terrain. I was navigating from memory, trying to retrace the path I had taken during the return. The industrial ruins all looked similar in the constant rain. Collapsed structures, corroded machinery, pools of acidic sludge. I missed the location twice. We backtracked. I found the collapsed wall where I'd left him. Rishin was still sitting against it. His head was tilted forward. His hands were in his lap. He was not moving. I reached him. I checked his rebreather. Still functioning. Filter at 18%. I checked his pulse through the suit's integrated monitor. Weak, rapid, still alive. Kellis was already opening the medical kit. He examined the damaged knee without touching it. The suit material had dissolved completely around the injury site. The tissue beneath was black. Necrotic. The acid had destroyed everything from mid-thigh to mid-calf. The bone was visible in places. It was pitted, corroding. Kellis looked at me. He said, "I can't treat this in the field. He needs surgical intervention and full decontamination. He needs it now." I knew this. I had known this when I left him. I said, "Can you stabilize him for transport?" Kellis considered. He said, "I can administer stimulants and coagulants. I can attempt to neutralize remaining acid on the wound surface. But moving him will accelerate the bleeding and toxin spread. He might not survive transport." "Will he survive if we leave him here?" "No." "Then we transport him." Kellis nodded. He worked quickly. He injected stimulants directly into Rishin's thigh, above the destroyed tissue. He packed the wound with a neutralization compound, using our entire remaining supply. The compound foamed and smoked as it reacted. Rishin woke up. He made a sound. Not quite a scream. He tried to pull away. I held him. I told him we were taking him back. He tried to focus on my face. His pupils were still dilated. He said something I could not understand. His voice was too faint. The vox was failing. I told him to save his strength. He stopped trying to talk. We rigged a transport carry using equipment webbing. Kellis took his shoulders. I took his legs carefully, trying not to contact the destroyed knee. We lifted him. He was heavier than I expected. Dead weight. We began moving. The return was worse than the initial extraction. Rishin was unconscious within 15 minutes. His breathing was shallow. The stimulants were keeping his heart functioning, but he had progressed beyond consciousness. His body was shutting down systematically. Kellis and I did not speak. We focused on movement. Step. Transfer weight. Step. The rain continued. The hiss of it. Constant. We reached the company perimeter after 92 minutes. I do not remember the last 30 minutes clearly. I remember Sergeant Hale meeting us at the perimeter. I remember him directing us to the medical shelter. I remember lowering Rishen onto the medical table. The medical officer, Lieutenant Grade, examined him for perhaps 40 seconds. Then he looked at me. He said, "Corporal, this man requires surgical amputation and intensive decontamination therapy. I do not have the equipment or supplies for either procedure. I can make him comfortable. That is all I can offer. Make him comfortable." That was the phrase for dying. I knew this. Everyone knew this. I said, "How long does he have?" "With palliative care, perhaps 6 hours, maybe 8. I looked at Rishen. He was still unconscious. His face was grey. His breathing was barely visible. I'd carried him back for this, to watch him die slowly instead of quickly. The calculation had been wrong. I should have stayed with him. I should have remained at that collapsed wall and waited with him until it ended instead of dragging him through 2 kilometers of hell for 6 more hours of system failure. But I had not known that was the choice. I had been operating on the assumption that return meant treatment meant survival. The assumption had been false. Lieutenant Grade administered something through Rishen's suit port. He said it would keep him from experiencing pain. He said Rishen would probably not regain consciousness. He said I should return to my duties. There was nothing more to be done. I did not return to my duties. I remained in the medical shelter. Sergeant Hale came in once. He looked at Rishen. He looked at me. He left without speaking. He did not order me to leave. This was a kindness. I recognized it as such. Revan died 4 hours and 17 minutes after we returned to the perimeter. He did not regain consciousness. His breathing simply became slower and slower until it stopped. The medical monitor showed his heart continuing for another 43 seconds after his breathing ceased. Then it stopped as well. The monitor made a sound, a steady tone. Lieutenant Grade reached over and deactivated it. The tone stopped. There was only the rain, the hiss of it on the shelter's roof, constant, unchanged. Riven was dead, and the rain continued exactly as it had before. Lieutenant Grade asked if I wanted to say anything. I did not understand the question. Say anything to whom? Rishen was dead. He could not process auditory input. Speaking would serve no function. I did not say anything. Lieutenant Grade recorded the death. Time of death, cause of death, identification number. He asked me if I wanted Rishen's personal effects. I said yes. There were no personal effects. Everything Rishen had owned was what he carried. His suit, his weapon, his field kit. All of it was company property. There was nothing that had been his specifically. Except the knowledge of how to reinforce knee seals using scavenged gasket material. Except the habit of checking seals every 4 minutes. Except the memory of him using a neutralization compound on my gloves without calculating whether I was worth the expenditure. I returned to my duties 6 hours later. There was an offensive launch. Equipment needed to be prepared. Seals needed to be checked and allocated. I performed these functions. I made the allocation decisions. I sent men into combat with equipment I knew would fail. Some of them died. I logged their deaths. I continued functioning. This was what remained. The offensive launched on schedule. Task Unit Epsilon participated. We advanced 4 kilometers. We withdrew 6 days later, having accomplished the tactical objectives. 19 casualties during the offensive. 7 men remained operational at its conclusion. I was one of them. I survived because I had functional equipment. I had allocated that equipment to myself. Other men died with compromised equipment because I had allocated it to them. The pattern continued. The system consumed them. I was the mechanism that sorted them into the consumption queue. We received replacement personnel. 14 new conscripts, young, poorly trained. I issued them equipment. I made the allocations. I gave them the compromised suits. They died at higher rates than experienced personnel. This was expected. This was acceptable. This was murder I committed by administrative decision. I logged their deaths accurately. I maintained proper documentation. No one questioned my procedures. The system accepted the deaths as inevitable and continued operating. I need to describe the period after Rishen's death differently because I experienced it differently. Time became strange. Not faster or slower exactly, just less relevant. Days occurred. Operations were conducted. Personnel died. Replacements arrived. The cycle repeated. I performed my function within this cycle, but I stopped marking the passage of time as meaningful. Day 147 felt identical to day 193. The numbers changed. The conditions did not. Rain, corrosion, equipment failure, death, documentation, repeat. I developed a habit during this period. I would check my seals every 4 minutes. I had continued Rishen's protocol after his death. But sometime during the 3rd month after he died, I realized I was not checking seals to maintain equipment function. I was checking them because it was what he would have done. The action had become memorial rather than maintenance. I was performing a ritual to preserve his methodology because his methodology was the only thing of his that remained in any accessible form. This was not logical. This was not efficient. I continued doing it anyway. Other men came and went. I processed them as resources. Some lasted weeks, some lasted days. Private Hennick lasted 17 days. He had been a factory worker before conscription. He asked me once if it got easier. I did not understand the question initially. He clarified. Did watching people die become easier with repetition? I told him the truth. No, it becomes different. The initial shock degrades. The emotional response flattens, but it does not become easier. It simply becomes something you are capable of continuing through. He nodded. He thanked me for being honest. He died 4 days later when his helmet seal failed during a routine patrol. The acid reached his face. He was dead before anyone could attempt intervention. I logged his death. I continued functioning. Specialist Corvin lasted 39 days. He was transferred in from another unit. Experienced, competent. He performed his duties efficiently. He did not talk unnecessarily. He reminded me of Riven in some ways. The quiet competence. The systematic approach to survival. I found myself giving him priority equipment allocation, better seals, functional filtration systems. I was doing it again, choosing to value someone's survival beyond operational justification. I recognized this. I did not stop. He died on day 39 when an enemy explosive device detonated during a building clearance. The explosion was not large enough to kill through concussive force, but it ruptured his suit in multiple locations simultaneously. He was exposed to atmospheric contact across 70% of his body surface. He lived for 6 minutes. I was present. I could not help. There was nothing to neutralize. Too much exposure, too many sites. I watched him dissolve. The acid worked faster when there were multiple exposure points. His skin separated, then muscle tissue. Then he stopped moving. Then he was something I needed to log and process for equipment recovery. I took his identification tags. I added him to the casualty list. I continued functioning. There were others. Corporal Drace, Private Yennik, Specialist Than. I remember their names because I logged their deaths. I remember some of their faces. Not clearly. The details have degraded, but I remember they existed. They functioned. They died. The system consumed them. I documented the consumption. This was my purpose. This was what I had become. On day 247, Sergeant Hale died. His suit had been compromised for weeks. We both knew it. There were no replacement suits available. Supplies had been delayed, or diverted, or simply never allocated to our sector. The reasons did not matter. The result was the same. Hale wore a suit with failing seals and continued leading operations because there was no one else trained in command function at his level. He died during a defensive action when his chest seal failed. The acid entered his suit. He maintained command for approximately 8 minutes while his chest cavity filled with corrosive atmospheric moisture. He issued orders. He directed fire. He coordinated the withdrawal. Then he stopped speaking. He remained standing for another 30 seconds. Then he fell. When we recovered his body, the tissue of his chest had been completely destroyed. His rib cage was visible. The bones were corroding. I logged his death. I was promoted to sergeant and assumed command of Task Unit Epsilon. Command meant I made all allocation decisions now, not just equipment, personnel assignments, operational priorities, casualty triage. I had authority over everything the remaining personnel did. Task Unit Epsilon consisted of 9 men at the time of my promotion. 9 men was not a combat-effective unit by any doctrinal standard, but doctrine was flexible when it came to acceptable unit strength. 9 men could perform reconnaissance. 9 men could hold a defensive position. 9 men could die attempting to achieve an objective that would be assigned to a full-strength company under normal circumstances. 9 men was what High Command had available. So 9 men was what they deployed. I made decisions in this role that I cannot articulate fully even now. I sent men into situations I knew they would not survive because the mission required those situations be explored. I allocated the last functional rebreather filter to 1 man, knowing another man would die from filtration failure as a result. I chose who lived and who died through administrative authority that no one questioned or audited. The system gave me this power because the system required someone to perform this sorting function, and I had demonstrated competence in resource management. I was good at determining who should die. That was my qualification for command. There was a period, I no longer remember exactly when, perhaps day 290 or 300, when I was alone for 6 days. Task Unit Epsilon had been reduced to 4 personnel. We were assigned to observation duty in a forward position. An enemy bombardment hit our position on the 2nd day. I was in the lower level of the structure conducting equipment inventory. The other 3 men were on the upper level maintaining observation posts. The structure collapsed. I was buried in the lower level. The other 3 men died. I was trapped under rubble in a small void space, unable to move, unable to call for help. My Vox system had been damaged during the collapse. I could receive transmissions, but not send them. I could hear the company net. I could hear operations continuing. I could hear casualty reports. I could not respond. I could not inform anyone I was alive. I existed in that space for 6 days. The void was perhaps 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. High enough I could sit upright, but not stand. Dark, completely dark after the first few hours when my helmet light failed. I had my suit. I had my rebreather. The filter was at 60% capacity when the collapse occurred. It would last perhaps 9 days if I remained still and maintained minimal respiratory rate. I had water, half a canteen. I had no food. I rationed the water. 3 small sips per day. I counted the days by monitoring my suit's chronometer. The display still functioned even though the communication system did not. During that period, I learned what consciousness experiences without external input. The first day I attempted to dig free. I could not. The rubble was too heavy. I could move small pieces, but the larger sections were beyond my strength, and shifting them risked further collapse. I stopped attempting to escape after approximately 8 hours. I conserved energy. I waited. I assumed recovery operations would search the ruins. I assumed they would find me. I maintained this assumption for 2 days. On the 3rd day, I accepted that recovery operations had either already searched the ruins and missed me, or had not searched because they assumed no survivors. I was not going to be found. I was going to die in this void space from dehydration or filter failure, whichever came first. I had perhaps 6 days of filter function remaining, perhaps 4 days before dehydration became critical. I would die here. This was now certainty rather than possibility. I did not panic. This is notable. I expected panic. I experienced something else instead, a kind of empty acceptance. I was going to die. This fact was established. The timeline was clear. There was nothing I could do to change it. Therefore, I could stop calculating survival probability. I could stop making decisions. I could simply exist until existence terminated. This was almost restful. Almost. But consciousness without input is not restful. It becomes something else. On the 4th day, I began experiencing auditory hallucinations. Not voices, sounds. The hiss of rain on suit material, even though I was buried and no rain could reach me. Footsteps. Breathing that was not my own breathing. I would hear these sounds and my body would respond, heart rate increasing. Adrenaline spiking, preparing for threat response. But there was nothing there, just darkness and the sounds my consciousness was generating to fill the absence of actual sensory data. On the 5th day, I started reviewing archived memories, not intentionally. The files would simply load. I would suddenly be experiencing a moment from before. The loading dock where we assembled for initial transport. The temperature, 19 degrees. I could feel it. Then the file would corrupt and I would be back in the darkness. My mother's hands, the chemical smell. Then darkness. Revan checking his seals every 4 minutes. The pattern was comforting. Then darkness. Corporal Vennick reaching for his throat. The wet pop of the failing seal. 14 minutes. Then darkness. I could not control which files were loaded. I could not stop them from loading. I would experience moments of archived memory with complete sensory detail, and then return to present darkness. The transitions became disorienting. I would lose track of which state was current. Was I in the darkness, or was the darkness the memory and current state was something else? Time started to fragment. The chronometer showed time passing, but the passage felt wrong. Hours would compress into what felt like minutes. Minutes would expand into what felt like hours. On the 6th day I heard digging. Real digging, not hallucination. I could feel vibration through the rubble. Voices, muffled but present. I tried to respond. My vox did not function. I started hitting the rubble above me with my field tool, creating noise, creating vibration, trying to signal. The digging continued. It was moving toward my position. I kept hitting the rubble, counting impacts, counting seconds between impacts, creating pattern. Someone would hear the pattern. Someone would recognize it as signal rather than random noise. The rubble above me shifted. Light penetrated the void. Gray light, acidic atmospheric light, but light. A face appeared in the gap. Private Senek from another unit. He saw me. He called for assistance. They extracted me over the next 40 minutes, removing rubble piece by piece until the void was large enough for me to crawl out. I emerged into the rain. The hiss of it. The constant, familiar hiss. I had not realized how much I had needed that sound until I heard it again. They took me back to the company position. I was debriefed. I was examined by lieutenant grade. Dehydration, minor malnutrition. Psychological stress responses within acceptable parameters for extended isolation. I was cleared for duty after 24 hours of rest and rehydration. I returned to duty. I resumed command of Task Unit Epsilon, except Task Unit Epsilon no longer existed. The other 3 personnel were dead. The unit designation was retired. I was reassigned as Logistics Coordinator for Task Unit Gamma, another understrength reconnaissance element operating in the same sector. The isolation had changed something. Not dramatically. Not in ways that were immediately obvious. But I noticed I was having difficulty with certain cognitive functions. Memory recall was slower. Decision-making required more conscious effort. I would find myself staring at equipment allocation lists for minutes at a time, unable to process what allocation was appropriate. The calculations that had become automatic were suddenly requiring active thought again. I mentioned this to Lieutenant Grade during a routine medical check. He noted it in my file. He said extended isolation sometimes caused temporary cognitive disruption. He said it would resolve with time and continued normal activity. He cleared me for continued duty. It did not resolve. Or perhaps it did resolve, but to a different baseline than before. I continued functioning. I performed my duties. But there was a distance now between the observation of circumstances and my processing of those circumstances. I would watch events occur and register them factually, but the connection between the events and any response felt delayed, attenuated. A man's suit would fail. I would observe the failure. I would note the timeline of his death, but the processing of what this meant, the way it connected to previous deaths, the pattern of system consumption, all of that would load slowly. Sometimes it would not load at all. The files were there, but accessing them required effort I could not always generate. Task Unit Gamma operated for 47 days before being disbanded due to casualties. I was transferred to Task Unit Kappa. I performed logistics coordination. I made allocation decisions. Men died. I logged the deaths. Task Unit Kappa lasted 32 days. I was transferred to Task Unit Sigma, 29 days. Transferred to Task Unit Rho, 41 days. The unit designations changed. The men changed. The outcomes did not change. Equipment failed. Men died. I documented the process. Somewhere during this period, I cannot identify exactly when, I stopped using names. Not consciously. I simply stopped encoding them. Men would introduce themselves and I would acknowledge, but the name would not archive. I would think of them by function or by physical description. The tall one, the one with the scarred hands, the one who checked his seals too frequently, the one who did not check his seals frequently enough. They would die, and I would log their identification numbers, but I would not remember their names. This was efficient. Names created connection. Connection created the liability of loss. I had already experienced that liability. I had watched Riven die. I had watched dozens of others die. Learning their names did not prevent their deaths. It only made the deaths more difficult to process. So I stopped learning names. I processed personnel as functional units. This was better. This was sustainable. I received a commendation on day 412. The commendation cited my exceptional performance in logistics coordination across multiple unit assignments. It noted my resource management had contributed to extended operational capability in severe environmental conditions. It was signed by a colonel whose name I did not recognize. The commendation was recorded in my service file. It meant I had performed the sorting function efficiently. I had allocated equipment and made decisions that killed men in ways that supported continued operations. This was what the Imperium valued. Not preventing deaths, optimizing deaths, making them useful. I had demonstrated competence in making deaths useful. I archived the commendation. I continued functioning. On day 439, I was reassigned to training duties. This was unusual. Training assignments were typically given to personnel who were no longer combat effective due to injury or psychological damage. I had been flagged for neither. I asked why I was being reassigned. The personnel officer said my expertise in environmental operations was needed for incoming conscript preparation. The next wave of personnel being deployed to Vorinth 7 required specialized training in suit maintenance and survival protocols. I had more practical experience in these areas than any other available instructor. Therefore, I would train them. This was logical. This was efficient use of my accumulated knowledge. This was assigning me to teach new personnel how to survive temporarily in an environment that would eventually kill them regardless of training quality. I accepted the assignment. I was transferred to the training facility in the secondary deployment zone, approximately 40 kilometers south of the primary operational area. The facility was a series of reinforced structures designed to provide temporary protection from atmospheric exposure during training exercises. The conscripts lived in these structures between training cycles. They ate standard rations. They slept on standard bunks. They attended instruction on equipment operation, suit maintenance, tactical movement, and survival protocols. I was responsible for the suit maintenance and survival protocol instruction. The first training group consisted of 47 conscripts, younger than I had been at conscription, 14, 15, perhaps 16 years old, pulled from hive factory districts mostly. Some agricultural settlements. One claimed to be from an upper hive education facility. I did not verify this. Their origins were irrelevant. They are here now. They would be deployed to the operational zones within 6 weeks. Most of them would die within 3 months of deployment. This was not speculation. This was a statistical projection based on observed survival rates. I was training them to extend their survival slightly, perhaps 3 weeks instead of 2, perhaps 4 months instead of 3. But extension was not a prevention. They would die. I was teaching them how to die slightly slower. I demonstrated proper seal inspection protocols. I showed them the microfractures in gasket material that indicated impending failure. I explained how to reinforce compromised seals using field-available materials. I taught them the checking sequence. Helmet coupling, neck seal, shoulder joints, elbow connections, glove seals, torso zip line, hip joints, knee connections, boot seals. Every 4 minutes. I made them practice. I made them repeat it until the sequence was automatic. I was teaching them Rishin's protocol. I was transmitting his survival methodology to personnel who would die using it but might die slightly slower because they had learned it. One of the conscripts asked me how long I had been deployed on Vorinth 7. I calculated 446 days as of that training session. He looked at me like I had said something impossible. He asked how I had survived that long. I told him the truth. Functional equipment, proper maintenance protocols, careful movement, resource management, statistical variance, and the deaths of approximately 230 other men whose equipment failures or tactical deaths had allowed me to continue functioning. He did not understand. He thought I was being metaphorical or philosophical. I was being precise. I existed now because others had not. Their deaths had created the probability space in which my survival occurred. This was not guilt. This was not the survivor's philosophy. This was a mathematical fact. In a system with limited resources and constant attrition, individual survival required collective death. I survived because the system consumed others instead of consuming me. Yet, I trained 6 groups of conscripts over the next 4 months, 273 personnel total. I provided them with the best instruction I could formulate. I taught them everything I knew about equipment maintenance and environmental survival. I demonstrated proper procedures. I made them practice until they could perform the protocols without conscious thought. Then they were deployed to the operational zones. I tracked their survival rates when possible. The data was incomplete. Unit casualty reports did not always specify individual causes of death or provide sufficient detail to determine if training had been applied. But from the data I could access, the conscripts I trained survived an average of 4.3 weeks longer than conscripts trained by other instructors. 4.3 weeks. This was the measurable value of everything I'd learned across 446 days of operational deployment. 4.3 weeks of extended survival before the system consumed them anyway. I should have felt something about this. Pride, perhaps, that my instruction had a measurable positive effect, or horror that the positive effect was so minimal, or satisfaction that I was contributing to operational efficiency. I felt nothing. Or not nothing exactly. I felt distant. The information that these personnel survived slightly longer was data I noted and archived. But the significance of that data, what it meant about my function or their deaths or the system that consumed both of us, that significance did not load. The files were there, but I could not access them with any emotional context. I simply continued training. New groups arrived. I instructed them. They deployed. They died. Repeat. On day 593, I received orders transferring me back to operational duty. The operational zones required experienced logistics coordination personnel. Training facility staffing was being restructured. I was being redeployed. I packed my equipment. I reported to the transport staging area. I was loaded onto a transport with 43 newly trained conscripts who were deploying for the first time. Some of them recognized me from training. They looked at me with something I eventually identified as hope. I was proof that survival beyond a few weeks was possible. I was evidence that the training worked. I did not correct this misunderstanding. It would serve no function. They would learn the actual parameters soon enough. We arrived at the operational zone on day 595. I was assigned to Task Unit Omega, another understrength reconnaissance element. 12 personnel, including myself. The unit commander was Lieutenant Varys, recently promoted from sergeant after his predecessor died during the previous operation cycle. He reviewed my service file. He noted my experience level. He assigned me as his logistics coordinator and second in command. I accepted the position. I performed the duties. I made the allocation decisions. Men died. I documented the deaths. The rain continued. It had been raining for 595 days. It would continue raining. The atmospheric conditions showed no sign of change. The corrosion continued. Equipment failed. Seals degraded. Filters clogged. Weapon systems corroded. Suit material dissolved. The maintenance cycle was constant. Clean, repair, replace when possible, improvise when replacement was impossible, document when improvisation failed. Repeat. This was existence on Vorinth 7. This was what the Imperium required. Continued function in an environment actively hostile to function. Survival measured in hours and days rather than years. Death accepted as inevitable but temporarily preventable through proper procedure. And when procedure failed, documentation of the failure so the next group could learn slightly better procedures that would also eventually fail. I think about Riven frequently, not intentionally. The files load without conscious access request. I will be performing some routine task, checking seals or cleaning a weapon or reviewing casualty reports, and suddenly I will remember his voice through the Vox telling me to stop calculating, or his hands showing me how to reinforce a knee seal, or the way he looked at me through his visor when I told him I was leaving to get support. He said he would wait. He did wait. I returned. He died anyway. The calculation had been wrong, but the intent had been correct. I had tried to save him. I had failed. The system had consumed him despite my attempt to prevent it. This is what the Imperium does. It consumes. It takes young men from factory districts and agricultural settlements and upper hive education facilities, and it processes them into ammunition. Human ammunition expended against enemies or environments or operational objectives. The consumption is efficient. Very little waste. Even the deaths serve function. Each death provides data. Each failure informs the next procedure. The conscript who dies from a failed knee seal teaches the next conscript to check knee seals more carefully. The conscript who dies despite checking his seals carefully teaches us that checking is necessary but not sufficient. We learn, we adapt, we optimize the process, and the system continues consuming. I am part of this system now, not a victim of it, a component. I make the decisions that feed personnel into the consumption mechanism. I allocate the equipment. I train the replacements. I document the outcomes. I am the sorting function made conscious. I know what I am doing. I understand the pattern. I continue doing it because this is what I was trained to do, and because stopping would require an act of defiance I am no longer capable of formulating. Defiance requires belief that something different is possible. I do not believe anything different is possible. This is the only operational state I can model. The Imperium consumes. I facilitate the consumption. This is my function. On day 617, Private Shelik asked me if it gets better. He had been deployed for 9 days. He had already witnessed 3 deaths from equipment failure. He was struggling to process this. He wanted to know if the constant dying became easier to witness. I looked at him. He was very young, 15, perhaps younger. I remembered Private Hennick asking me almost the same question. I had told Hennick the truth. I told Shelik the truth as well. No, it does not get better. It becomes different. The initial shock wears off. You become capable of continuing function while it happens around you, but it does not become easier. It simply becomes what existence consists of. He nodded. He did not thank me. 3 days later, his rebreather filter failed. He suffocated over the course of 40 minutes while we attempted to clear the clogged filter material. We failed. He died. I logged his death. I continued functioning. This is day 641. I am still performing logistics coordination for Task Unit Omega. We currently have 8 operational personnel. We have been assigned reconnaissance duties in the eastern sectors, pending the next major offensive operation. I do not know when the next offensive will occur. I do not know how many personnel remain in the theater. I do not know if the campaign objectives have been achieved or modified or abandoned. This information is not provided to unit-level personnel. We receive operational orders, we execute those orders, we report outcomes. The larger strategic situation is beyond our access level. I still check my seals every 4 minutes. The protocol is automatic now. I do not think about it. My hands perform the sequence while I focus on other tasks. Helmet coupling, neck seal, shoulder joints, elbow connections, glove seals, torso zip line, hip joints, knee connections, boot seals. 35 seconds. Every 4 minutes. I have been doing this for 641 days. The protocol has kept me alive. Or statistical variance has kept me alive, and the protocol is simply correlated rather than causal. I cannot determine which. I continue the protocol regardless. I do not expect to survive the next offensive operation. This is not pessimism. This is statistical projection. I have survived 641 days. The average survival duration for personnel in my operational role is approximately 130 days. I am operating in the extreme tail of the distribution curve. Probability suggests regression to mean. My equipment is showing degradation across multiple systems. Seal integrity is diminishing. Filter efficiency is below optimal levels. Weapon function is compromised. I have been requesting replacement equipment for 3 weeks. Replacement has not been provided. Supply chains are disrupted, or supplies are being allocated to higher priority units, or supplies do not exist. The reason does not matter. The result is I will enter the next operation with compromised equipment. Compromised equipment increases casualty probability substantially. I will probably die during the next operation. I am not afraid of this. I was afraid during the drop insertion on day 1. I was afraid during the isolation period when I was buried in the rubble. I am not afraid now. Fear requires investment in continued survival. I no longer maintain that investment. I function because functioning is what I do. When I stop functioning, I will stop. This seems acceptable. This seems like the natural conclusion of the pattern. The system consumes. Eventually it will consume me. I have watched it consume hundreds of others. My turn will come. This is simply operational reality. What remains of me when this ends? This is a question I have been processing recently. Not the physical remains. Those will be logged and processed per standard procedure if recovery is possible. If recovery is not possible, I will be listed as missing presumed dead, and the designation will be updated to confirmed dead after sufficient time has passed, without contact. The administrative process is clear. But what remains of the person I was before conscription? What remains of the 17-year-old factory worker who stood on a loading dock counting boot scrapes and feeling the 19-degree temperature and not understanding what the transport vessel actually meant? Nothing remains. That person was consumed completely. The process was systematic. Remove from familiar environments, strip identity markers, introduce death as a routine event. Provide training and facilitation of system violence. Reward compliance with temporary survival. The person who entered the system was processed into a component of the system. The component functions. The person does not exist. But there are fragments, archived files, my mother's hands, the chemical smell, the temperature of the loading dock. Riven showing me how to reinforce a knee seal. These files persist. They load occasionally without request. They remind me that there was a before, that I existed in a state that was not this. The files do not restore that state. They simply confirm it occurred. This is perhaps what remains. Evidence of previous existence. Archived, rarely accessed, corrupted in places, but present. I am recording this because recording is what I do. I document, I log, I maintain records. This is my function. When I stop functioning, this record will exist. Someone may access it. Someone may read the casualty reports and the equipment logs and the allocation decisions. Someone may learn slightly better procedures from my documented failures. This is the only continuation I can model. Not legacy, not remembrance. Simply data that informs the next iteration of the process. The rain continues. 641 days of constant rain, the hiss of it on suit material, the way it eats through equipment slowly, inexorably. The pools of acidic sludge that settle in the low points of every structure. The yellow-gray sky that never clears. This is Vorinth the Seventh. This is where the Imperium sent hundreds of men to die achieving objectives that may or may not have strategic value. This is where I have existed for 641 days. This is where I will die. Probably soon, definitely eventually. I think the system functions this way everywhere, not just Vorinth 7. Every world, every campaign, every unit. The specifics change. The environment, the enemy, the exact mechanisms of death, but the pattern is identical. The Imperium requires continued function. Function requires resources. Personnel are resources. Resources are consumed. The consumption is optimized through proper allocation and documentation. Those who perform allocation and documentation functions are rewarded with temporary survival. Temporary survival extends until probability or equipment failure or enemy action terminates it. Then the next person assumes the function. The system continues. This is not evil. Evil requires intent. The system does not intend harm. It simply requires function and accepts that function consumes those who perform it. This is operational necessity. The Imperium is so vast, the threats so numerous, the resources so limited relative to requirements, that individual survival cannot be prioritized. The system must persist. Therefore, the system consumes individuals to maintain persistence. I understand this. I participate in this. I am consumed by this. These facts coexist without contradiction. What would I tell the 17-year-old on the loading dock if I could access that moment and provide information? I do not know. I have processed this question extensively. There is no information I could provide that would change the outcome. Conscription is not optional. Deployment occurs regardless of individual preference. Death probability is high, regardless of preparation level. The only variable is timeline. With proper training and maintenance protocols, survival extends slightly. But extension is not escape. The system consumes eventually. Perhaps I would tell him to remember the temperature. 19 degrees. The cool air, the visible breath. The sound of boot scrapes. The last moment before everything changed. Archive that moment clearly. Because that memory will be the last thing that confirms you existed as something other than a component. And when the system has consumed everything else, that memory will be what remains to indicate there was a person here once who felt temperature and heard sounds and existed in a state that was not this. But I cannot access that moment. It is archived, corrupted, rarely loaded. The person in that moment is gone. I am what remains, a component that documents, a function that allocates, a consciousness that continues processing until it stops. Task Unit Omega has received operational orders. We deploy at dawn. 6 hours from now. I've checked all the equipment. I've made the final allocations. I've logged the current status. Everything is prepared as well as possible with available resources. The men are resting. I should rest as well. I will not rest. I will check my seals. Every 4 minutes. Until dawn. Then we will move out into the rain. The constant rain. The hiss of it. And we will perform the assigned function until the function is complete or until we are consumed attempting to complete it. This is day 641. This is Vorinth the 7th. This is what the Imperium requires. This is what remains. The system consumes. I document. The rain continues.